The medieval world smelled before it was ever seen. Imagine the narrow streets of a city where sewage ran openly in ditches, where animals and humans lived side by side, and where baths were not part of daily life but rather rare, sometimes even condemned as sinful indulgences. In this environment, intimacy between two people was far from the polished and romanticized image we often imagine today. Sex in the Middle Ages unfolded under the shadow of constant filth, disease, and a raw reality that stripped away any notion of glamour. To touch someone was to encounter not only their flesh, but also the accumulated dirt, sweat, and infections of a life without soap or clean water. It was a contact with risk, yet it was unavoidable, and perhaps this very danger made it both feared and strangely accepted as part of survival. For most people, the idea of regular bathing simply did not exist. Water itself was often contaminated, and many believed that opening the pores with hot baths could actually invite illness. The church preached against excessive cleansing, linking nudity with sin, and so what lingered on bodies was not just dust and sweat, but the weight of a belief system that discouraged purity of skin. When men and women came together in darkened rooms, their union carried with it the sour smell of woolen garments never properly washed, the rot of teeth rarely cleaned, and the heavy presence of disease that circulated quietly in every village. If this story moved you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapters that reveal what history often tried to hide. And tell me, what time is it right now where you are watching from? Share it in the comments, because our journey becomes even more powerful when we know where in the world you are. Sexual contact became a conduit for illnesses that were poorly understood and rarely treated. Venereal diseases spread easily, leaving behind lesions and fevers that were attributed to curses, demonic punishment, or bad humors of the body. A simple night of passion could mark someone for life, yet because of ignorance, partners often did not know where the sickness began or how it moved from one person to another. Physicians prescribed strange remedies, drinking mercury, applying crushed herbs over the genitals, or bleeding the patient to expel the illness. In reality, these treatments only worsened the suffering, leaving people to endure their pain in silence. Stories survive of nobles whose flesh was eaten away by infection, and of peasants whose marriages turned into prisons of shared disease. But beyond the dangers of infection, the very concept of desire was clouded by suspicion. Odors were overwhelming, and the body itself was an unpredictable source of discomfort. Without the modern habits of trimming, washing, or caring for personal hygiene, sex was often quick, mechanical, and stripped of tenderness. Imagine the straw mattresses filled with lice, the candlelight that flickered to reveal sores or wounds, the knowledge that tomorrow's labor in the fields would once again cover both bodies in dirt. Yet despite all this, men and women continued to seek each other in shadows, perhaps driven by instincts stronger than reason, perhaps by the need to feel alive in a world where death hovered so close. Diseases spread not only through desire, but also through the lack of barriers between public and private life. In cities, brothels thrived under official tolerance, and soldiers, merchants, and clerics alike made use of them. These places were breeding grounds for infections that returned home with men to unsuspecting wives. A single encounter could set in motion a chain of suffering that touched entire families. Yet the knowledge of these dangers did little to stop people, because pleasure, however forbidden, was one of the few escapes from the harshness of medieval existence. The weight of dirt and disease shaped the way intimacy was perceived. Instead of being a moment of pure connection, it was tainted with fear. Mothers warned daughters that men carried curses in their touch. Preachers thundered that lust opened the door to damnation. And yet, in the silence of their beds, people still reached for one another, holding close the very source of danger. The contradiction was striking. Sex was essential for survival through procreation, but it was also a reminder of fragility, of the thin line between life and decay. Some chronicles describe entire communities devastated by epidemics thought to have spread through intimate contact, though at the time people explained them through superstition. A woman who fell ill after a lover's embrace was said to have been bewitched, her body poisoned by sin. Men who wasted away from sores were mocked as weak or accused of consorting with demons. Shame and ignorance were as painful as the diseases themselves, leaving victims isolated not only in their sickness, but also in their social standing. Yet perhaps the most haunting element was how normalized it all became. People grew accustomed to the smells, the sores, the risks, because they had no alternative. What for us today would be unbearable was, for them, simply life. The absence of hygiene was not just a background detail, but the very stage on which every act of intimacy unfolded. And in that stage, behind the dirt and pain, society built systems to contain and exploit sexuality, turning it into a tool for control, for commerce, and for survival. It is within this raw and unsanitized reality that the story of medieval sexuality truly begins. The constant presence of disease and decay set the foundation for everything else. The rise of prostitution as a tolerated outlet, the rigid rules of marriage designed to control lineage, and the suffocating grip of religion over the body and its desires. What seemed like personal acts were never just private matters, but parts of a larger struggle between instinct, morality, and the unforgiving conditions of daily life. And as the shadows deepened in those centuries, new contradictions and darker truths emerged, pulling intimacy even further from the realm of freedom and closer into the hands of power. In the dim corners of medieval towns, beyond the watchful gaze of the church and the rigid rules of marriage, there existed a profession both despised and indispensable. Prostitution was not just common, it was woven into the very fabric of society, tolerated as a necessary outlet in a world where desire collided with the heavy weight of sin. It thrived in brothels sanctioned by city councils, in makeshift rooms along trade routes, and even in discreet arrangements within noble courts. To understand medieval sexuality, one cannot look away from this paradox, a world that condemned lust with fire and brimstone, yet built entire economies upon the bodies of women who sold it. Many cities in Europe regulated prostitution openly, charging taxes on brothels that filled the coffers of local authorities. In places like Paris, Cologne, or London, official red light districts were established, sometimes even under the shadow of churches. These women were both shunned and sought after, branded with shame yet courted by men of every class. A merchant returning from a long journey, a soldier drunk on ale, or even a priest craving what his vows denied him, all could be found in the same dimly lit rooms. The hypocrisy was striking, but it was precisely this contradiction that allowed prostitution to flourish without ever truly being eradicated. For many women, entering this world was not a choice born of desire, but of survival. Poverty, hunger, and the absence of protection forced countless daughters into selling their bodies. Orphans with no dowry, widows with children to feed, and peasants fleeing famine found in prostitution the only way to endure. It was a path carved not by freedom, but by desperation. And once inside, escape was rare, for the stigma clung to them like a mark of fire, barring them from respectable marriage or work. Stories survive of women branded as harlots for life, cast aside even after leaving the trade, their reputations forever bound to the shadows of their past. Yet brothels were not only tolerated, they were often managed by figures who wielded unexpected power. Some were overseen by wealthy women who turned exploitation into business, controlling a network of prostitutes and negotiating with local officials. Others fell under the control of corrupt clergymen or city leaders who quietly profited while publicly condemning the very acts they facilitated. This duality gave prostitution a strange legitimacy, as if the sins of the flesh could be cleansed by the silver coins they produced. But behind the financial transactions lay lives of constant danger. Disease lurked in every embrace, violence was an ever-present threat, and the law offered little protection for women who had been cast outside the margins of honor. In the eyes of society, their suffering was deserved, their pain invisible. Even so, the brothel remained a hub of activity, a place where men laughed, drank, and surrendered to pleasures they would later deny in confession. It was here that the harsh reality of medieval life met its most intimate contradictions. Curiously, some rulers defended the existence of prostitution as a way to preserve order. Better, they argued, to have men seek out prostitutes than to risk the violation of honest women. In their eyes, these women bore the burden of sin so that others might be spared. They became scapegoats of lust, condemned yet tolerated, degraded yet essential. It is chilling to consider how entire societies built their moral order upon the sacrifice of a marginalized class, whose suffering was disguised as protection for the rest. Even art and literature could not fully ignore this reality. Ballads and tales whispered of lustful encounters in brothels, often mocking or ridiculing the women while excusing the men. Illustrations in secret manuscripts depicted prostitutes with exaggerated features, caricatures that reinforced their otherness. And yet, their presence was undeniable, shaping not only the hidden desires of men, but also the moral codes that attempted to control them. What makes this history even more unsettling is the way prostitution intersected with religion. While priests condemned lust from the pulpit, records show that many churchmen themselves visited brothels. Some even kept mistresses disguised as servants or nieces. The hypocrisy was so widespread that councils were forced to issue repeated bans, though enforcement was weak. This blurred boundary between condemnation and participation made prostitution not only a tolerated evil, but a reflection of the very corruption that seeped through medieval institutions. And while these women bore the heaviest weight, the consequences rippled outward. Wives lived in fear of diseases their husbands might bring home. Families whispered about daughters who had disappeared into city brothels. Whole communities knew who the prostitutes were, yet continued to rely on their presence. It was a cycle of silence, shame, and necessity, one that revealed more about the society that allowed it than about the women themselves. The brothels, the streets, the whispered transactions, they all served as a mirror of medieval life, exposing the fragile line between morality and survival. But this shadowed profession was not the only system of control shaping intimacy. At the very heart of medieval sexuality lay a far more rigid structure. one designed not for pleasure or escape, but for preserving wealth, bloodlines, and obedience. If prostitution revealed society's hypocrisy, arranged marriages revealed its cold pragmatism. And within those contracts of duty and property, intimacy was no less constrained, no less burdened by rules that turned love itself into a rare and dangerous luxury. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely the story of passion or the pursuit of happiness. It was, above all else, a contract. Families, nobles, and entire dynasties treated it as a transaction, a way to secure land, forge alliances, or consolidate power. For peasants, marriage could mean merging small plots of farmland or ensuring survival through shared labor. For nobles, it was often nothing less than a matter of politics and inheritance, where the body of a bride was not her own, but a vessel through which property and bloodlines could be controlled. Love, if it appeared at all, was an accident, an unexpected and often dangerous guest in a house built on duty. Arranged marriages were often decided long before a couple had even reached maturity. A girl of 12 might be promised to a man twice her age, the decision made over a feast, where her father signed away her future in exchange for land or influence. Young brides walked into marital homes carrying not affection, but the weight of expectation, their innocence bound to the authority of men who saw them as pieces on a chessboard. Their voices were seldom heard in these decisions, and their desires were rarely acknowledged. In this way, sex became an extension of duty, a continuation of the contract, an obligation to produce heirs rather than a pursuit of intimacy. The absence of personal choice in marriage created a cold atmosphere in many homes. Husbands and wives often began their lives together as strangers, learning each other's habits through daily routines rather than tender exploration. The bedroom was a space where lineage was secured, not where affection bloomed. A noble woman's body, in particular, was a battleground for inheritance, her fertility carefully monitored, her loyalty guarded with suspicion. Tales abound of women locked away, guarded by servants or relatives, their movements restricted to ensure that the legitimacy of children could never be questioned. For a woman accused of infidelity, the punishment was severe, for it was not just her honor at stake, but the integrity of entire bloodlines. For men, the rules bent more easily. While wives were expected to remain faithful under threat of public humiliation or worse, husbands often sought fulfillment elsewhere. Visits to brothels were common, as were affairs with servants or even women from neighboring estates. The double standard was so deeply entrenched that it was not seen as contradiction, but as natural order. What mattered was not morality, but control, and the burden of that control always fell hardest on the woman. And yet, even within such rigid boundaries, moments of rebellion flickered. Some chronicles tell of women who resisted arranged unions, who fled convents where they had been forced into vows, or who sought love outside the iron cage of obligation. Troubadour poetry of the 12th century, for instance, sang of courtly love, romanticizing the secret longing between knights and married noblewomen, a kind of fantasy that existed precisely because marriage itself was so devoid of tenderness. These tales remind us that even in a world ruled by contracts, the human heart strained against its chains, seeking warmth in forbidden places. Among peasants, marriages were less political, but no less transactional. Families arranged unions to ensure survival through labor, and dowries, whether land, animals, or household goods, were crucial. A marriage could lift a family out of hunger or plunge it into ruin. The expectations were clear: to work side by side in the fields, to bear children who could share the burden of survival, and to maintain the fragile balance of village life. Romance, if it appeared, was often swallowed by necessity. Even so, local festivals and communal gatherings sometimes offered opportunities for young people to glimpse each other before arrangements were finalized, small sparks of choice in a system that rarely allowed it. The church, of course, hovered over these unions with iron authority. It dictated who could marry whom, banned unions within certain degrees of kinship, and reinforced the idea that marriage was indissoluble. Annulments were rare and usually reserved for the powerful, while ordinary people remained bound for life, even in unions filled with misery or abuse. To the clergy, marriage was a sacrament, a sacred covenant, and sex within it was tolerated only as a means of procreation. Desire was suspect, pleasure sinful, and love irrelevant. What mattered was the production of children and the preservation of order. The shadow of these beliefs stretched into every household, shaping the most intimate interactions between husband and wife. Women were taught to submit, to silence their feelings, and to accept their role as obedient partners. Men were told that their authority was divinely ordained, their rights unquestionable. The imbalance was stark, and yet it was cloaked in the language of faith, making resistance appear as rebellion not only against family, but against God himself. But behind the facade of order lay the unspoken truths. Many marriages were marked by loneliness, resentment, and secrecy. Husbands and wives performed their duties by day, while their nights carried the silence of unfulfilled desires. The human need for affection could not be extinguished by rules or contracts, and in that tension, society's hypocrisy deepened. For every sermon preached about purity, there were whispered confessions of betrayal. For every marriage arranged to preserve honor, there were hidden affairs that risked destroying it. This world of rigid unions, of contracts masquerading as relationships, reveals not only the suffocating grip of obligation, but also the fertile ground for hypocrisy, secrecy, and sin. If prostitution showed the contradiction of a society that condemned lust while profiting from it, arranged marriages revealed its cold machinery turning people into instruments of power, and in this machinery, another force exerted its influence even more profoundly, casting a shadow not only over marriage, but over every private moment in the medieval world. The relentless presence of religion, dictating how, when, and even if intimacy could take place. Religion was not simply a background presence in the medieval world, it was the air people breathed, the voice in their heads, and the shadow in their most private moments. When it came to sex, the church exerted a grip so suffocating that intimacy itself was transformed into a battlefield of guilt, fear, and control. From the pulpit, priests thundered warnings that lust was a gateway to damnation, that every movement of the body had to be scrutinized under God's watchful eye. Desire was no longer a natural force, but a dangerous temptation, and rules multiplied to regulate not only who could marry whom, but how, when, and even in what position one could touch their spouse. The manuals of confession written by priests reveal a chilling level of intrusion into the bedroom. Faithful were asked to confess not just if they had committed adultery or fornication, but whether they had indulged in certain positions, touched their partners in ways considered improper, or sought pleasure beyond what was necessary to conceive a child. The list of forbidden days was long. No sex on Sundays, no sex on feast days, no sex during Lent, Advent, or even the days before communion. For some couples, nearly half the calendar year was restricted. To break these rules was not just a private indiscretion, but a mortal sin, a stain on the soul that demanded confession and penance. This obsessive regulation was rooted in the belief that sex existed only to ensure reproduction. Any act that strayed from this purpose was viewed as corrupt. Even within marriage, pleasure itself was seen as suspicious, something that could taint the purity of the sacrament. Wives who showed too much desire were labeled as sinful, accused of being guided by demonic impulses. Husbands who pursued pleasure for its own sake risked condemnation as well. The irony, of course, was that these very restrictions often fueled the very impulses they sought to suppress, driving people into secrecy and shame. Curiously, the Church's teachings were not uniform. Some theologians argued that marital sex, while dangerous, could be sanctified through love and moderation. Others insisted that lust was always sinful, even between spouses. Theologians like Augustine cast a long shadow, teaching that original sin was transmitted through the act of intercourse, making every coupling a reminder of humanity's fall from grace. This idea haunted generations, embedding the sense that the body itself was a source of corruption. The effect of these teachings was profound. Couples entered their marriages already burdened with the notion that what they felt for each other was tainted, that their intimacy was a compromise with sin. Confessors demanded to know the details of their private lives, and penances could be humiliating. There are records of men walking barefoot to churches, flogging themselves in public, or giving alms as punishment for having indulged in what we today would consider natural expressions of affection. Women, on the other hand, often bore the heavier weight of judgment seen as the root of temptation, echoes of Eve, who had first led man astray. Yet the paradox was everywhere. While sermons condemned lust, the very architecture of cathedrals whispered of human desire, carvings hidden in the stonework, grotesque figures exposing themselves, scenes of coupling tucked into corners, remind us that sexuality was never fully silenced. Pilgrims who walked holy roads passed shrines decorated with fertility symbols, echoes of pagan rituals that the Church tried but failed to erase completely. The tension between repression and persistence of desire became one of the defining features of medieval sexuality. For ordinary people, this meant living in a state of constant contradiction. They were told to embrace marriage as a holy sacrament, yet to fear the very act that sustained it. They were instructed to be fruitful and multiply, but to feel shame in the pleasure that made it possible. This created a society where guilt was almost inevitable, where confession became not only a spiritual act, but also a means of surveillance, ensuring that even the most intimate spaces remained under ecclesiastical control. The Church also used sex as a tool of power. By dictating who could marry, it controlled alliances between families, especially among the nobility. By forbidding divorce, it trapped people in unions that could not be escaped. By labeling certain unions as incestuous, even among distant relatives, it gained the power to dissolve marriages when politically convenient. Intimacy became less about two individuals and more about the authority of an institution that claimed to speak for God. But what is perhaps most unsettling is how deeply these teachings shaped the way people viewed themselves. Desire was no longer simply a natural longing. It was a source of personal torment, a proof of human weakness. A husband who wanted his wife too often, a wife who longed for her husband outside the approved days, both were taught to feel shame. And in that shame, the Church found its greatest weapon, for people who feel unclean are easier to control. Still, the human heart is not easily subdued. Despite the weight of sermons and the fear of damnation, people found ways to bend the rules. Some couples confessed less than they were guilty of. Some ignored their restrictions quietly, comforting themselves with the belief that God might forgive what priests condemned. Others sought secret outlets for their desires, fueling the growth of the very practices and professions the church publicly despised. The repression of intimacy did not destroy desire. It transformed it, driving it underground, reshaping it into something furtive, secretive, and often dangerous. And it is within that shadowed underground where we discover the darker side of medieval sexuality, the myths, superstitions, and false beliefs that filled the void left by ignorance and repression. With science absent and medicine bound to superstition, people turned to wild theories about the body and its functions. These myths, dangerous and bizarre, shaped how men and women understood themselves, and often dictated choices that could alter their lives forever. The absence of real science in the Middle Ages opened the door for superstition to dominate every aspect of human life, and nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of sex and the human body. What people believed about desire, fertility, and the functions of men and women was not rooted in biology, but in myths, whispered traditions, and distorted fragments of ancient philosophy. These beliefs were not harmless curiosities. They carried the weight of life and death, dictating how people behaved, how marriages unfolded, and how individuals viewed their own flesh. To live in this world was to be surrounded by illusions that were taken as unquestionable truths. One of the most striking myths concerned the female body. It was widely believed that a woman could not conceive unless she reached orgasm. Physicians, influenced by ancient texts, claimed that both male and female seed were required to create life. This idea placed enormous pressure on women, yet it was a paradox. The same society that demanded female chastity also insisted that her pleasure was a necessary ingredient for conception. Men questioned barren wives, suspecting that they had failed to feel desire, while women suffered in silence, knowing that their worth was measured almost entirely by their ability to produce children. The myth gave rise to awkward rituals in marriage beds, where duty and superstition collided in ways that blurred the line between intimacy and obligation. Other beliefs were far more sinister. Menstruation, for instance, was viewed with dread. A menstruating woman was thought to carry poison in her blood, capable of spoiling crops, souring wine, or even causing illness in men who touched her. Some claimed that if a menstruating woman looked directly into a mirror, it would tarnish, or if she touched newborns, they would wither. This fear isolated women monthly, turning a natural cycle into a mark of impurity and suspicion. Husbands avoided their wives during these times, not only because of religious rules, but because of fear, embedding shame into the very essence of womanhood. The wandering womb was another bizarre theory. Physicians insisted that a woman's uterus was not fixed in place, but roamed around her body like a restless creature, causing hysteria, fainting, or fits of madness whenever it strayed too far. Remedies for this supposed condition bordered on the grotesque. Midwives advised placing strong-smelling substances near a woman's nose to repel the womb downward, or perfumed oils near her genitals to lure it back into position. These practices reflected both the ignorance and the fear that surrounded female anatomy, turning women into mysteries to be controlled rather than understood. Superstitions also governed how people viewed sexual positions and acts. The church reinforced the belief that only the missionary position was acceptable, anything else being sinful and dangerous to the soul. But beyond morality, myths suggested that certain positions could deform a child in the womb or influence its gender. Couples desperate for a son were instructed to time intercourse in strange ways, facing certain directions or avoiding particular days of the lunar cycle. Failure to obey these unwritten rules often brought guilt, with parents blaming themselves for the health or gender of their children. Perhaps even more unsettling were the myths about male sexuality. It was believed that excessive sexual activity drained a man of his vitality, weakening his body and mind. Some physicians compared semen to blood, claiming that too much release was equivalent to losing one's strength or shortening one's lifespan. Men were warned that indulgence could lead to blindness, insanity, or early death. These fears created anxiety, with men torn between their natural desires and the constant threat of losing their health to their own impulses. In the absence of real contraception, couples turned to remedies that ranged from bizarre to deadly. Women were told to drink mixtures of herbs, mercury, or even ground animal bones to prevent pregnancy. Some wore amulets inscribed with prayers, believing that sacred words could block conception. Others carried stones or animal parts as charms against fertility. These practices not only failed, but often poisoned the women who followed them, leaving a trail of suffering disguised as protection. It is haunting to imagine how many lives were cut short not by sin, as people believed, but by the desperate reliance on these dangerous remedies. What tied all these myths together was the way they reinforced control. Women were constantly portrayed as unstable, dangerous, or incomplete without male guidance, while men were warned that their own desires could destroy them. Sex became not only a matter of duty, but of constant suspicion, a theater where superstition dictated every movement. The body itself became a puzzle wrapped in fear, with every natural function interpreted as a sign of divine favor or demonic corruption. And yet, in the cracks of this superstition, human curiosity persisted. Some scholars began to question these beliefs, drawing upon translations of ancient texts from the Arab world, where medicine was more advanced. New ideas trickled slowly into Europe, offering glimpses of a more rational understanding of anatomy and health. But these voices were drowned out by the roar of tradition and the myths endured, shaping generations who grew up believing that their very desires were mysteries too dangerous to explore. The persistence of these superstitions left scars that went beyond the body. They created shame, silenced questions, and turned natural impulses into sources of fear. Men and women alike lived under a cloud of misinformation, their most intimate experiences dictated by forces they could neither see nor control. And this climate of fear and ignorance did not remain confined to the household. It spread outward, influencing laws, shaping punishments, and fueling some of the darkest judgments of the medieval era. For when myths about sex and the body were combined with suspicion and power, they gave birth to accusations that destroyed lives, punishments that left scars, and institutions that thrived on control. And it was within this atmosphere that sex itself became not an act of connection, but a source of danger, obligation, and betrayal. Sex in the Middle Ages was rarely framed as a pursuit of mutual pleasure. For most people, it was perceived as duty, an obligation tied to marriage contracts, family expectations, and the demands of religion. This sense of obligation was heaviest for women, who were taught from girlhood that their bodies did not belong to them, but to their fathers, their husbands, and above all, to the lineage their wombs were meant to preserve. The very language of the time reflects this view. Medieval texts referred to wives as owed to their husbands, their role not defined by desire but by service. What unfolded in the privacy of their chambers was not intimacy as we understand it today, but a performance of expectations, one that often left both partners trapped in silence. For women, sex was framed as a marital debt. Theologians and confessors alike emphasized that a wife was bound to give herself to her husband whenever he demanded, regardless of her own feelings. Refusal was seen as sin, a violation of the vows of obedience she carried into the marriage. Yet at the same time, if she showed too much eagerness, if she dared to seek pleasure or express longing, she was condemned as lustful, a servant of temptation. This contradiction created a suffocating space where women were expected to submit but not enjoy, to comply but not engage. Their role was to endure, to conceive, and to protect the sanctity of the household through silence. Men, too, carried a burden, though of a different kind. They were instructed to control their desires, to use their wives only for procreation and never for indulgence. Excessive passion was seen as weakness, a surrender to the flesh that could damn the soul. Manuals written for husbands warned against seeking pleasure outside the purpose of conceiving children, even within marriage, but the reality often diverged from the teaching. Husbands demanded their rights, visited brothels, or sought affairs, all while preaching the virtues of restraint. What remained constant was the double standard. The man's failings were tolerated as natural weakness, while the woman's slightest hint of desire was treated as scandal. The silence around female pleasure was profound. Few medieval texts even acknowledged the possibility of women experiencing joy in sex. When it was mentioned, it was often framed as dangerous or shameful. A wife who longed for her husband too much risked being compared to Eve, the woman whose desire brought ruin to mankind. Physicians, clergymen, and even poets reinforced the idea that female sexuality was something to be controlled or feared. As a result, generations of women entered marriage with no guidance, no vocabulary for their own bodies, and no right to claim satisfaction. There are haunting glimpses of this reality in court records and confessional accounts. Wives accused of refusing their husbands were sometimes dragged before ecclesiastical courts, forced to defend themselves against charges of sin for not submitting. Husbands, meanwhile, could accuse their wives of frigidity, a word that carried moral judgment rather than medical meaning. In these cases, a woman's reluctance was rarely seen as resistance. It was framed as fault, as imperfection in fulfilling the role expected of her. To imagine the loneliness of these women is to glimpse a world where silence itself was survival. The physical environment of sex only deepened this sense of obligation. With little knowledge of hygiene, childbirth looming as a constant threat, and medical myths surrounding conception, many women endured sex, not as an act of closeness, but as another form of labor. The fear of pregnancy, of dying in childbirth, or of bringing another mouth into a starving household was ever present. Yet refusal was rarely an option. The cycle of duty pressed on, generation after generation, leaving behind a trail of weary bodies and unspoken pain. Still, human beings are never entirely stripped of longing. Even within this suffocating framework, moments of tenderness and rebellion existed. Some couples, against the weight of doctrine, found ways to share affection, to carve out small spaces of connection. Troubadour poetry and folk songs, though idealized, reflect the possibility that love and desire sometimes slipped through the cracks of obligation. But these moments were fragile, often hidden, for to speak openly of passion risked drawing suspicion or judgment. The imbalance between duty and pleasure created a society where intimacy was more often endured than embraced. Women lived under the weight of silence, men under the pressure of control, and both under the constant gaze of religion. The act that should have bound two people together became another expression of power, hierarchy, and expectation. This system not only shaped marriages, but also spilled into the wider culture, reinforcing the idea that sexuality was dangerous unless tightly controlled. And yet, the more society sought to control it, the more it revealed its own contradictions. The rules and obligations created not purity, but hypocrisy. Men who preached restraint indulged in secret. Women who were told to be silent whispered to one another in confidence. Families that prized honor above all else concealed scandals that broke their own codes. Out of this tension, darker elements emerged. Severe punishments for adultery, accusations of sin that destroyed reputations, and laws that made private lives a matter of public judgment. And it was here, at the intersection of silence and surveillance, where sex in the Middle Ages transformed into something more than duty. It became a stage where betrayal, punishment, and control played out with devastating consequences. Adultery in the Middle Ages was more than a betrayal of love. It was a crime that threatened the very foundations of society. For marriage was not only a private bond, but a contract that secured property, lineage, and political stability. When a spouse strayed, it was not framed simply as a personal failure. It was seen as a wound to the honor of families, a crack in the fragile structure of social order. And because the stakes were so high, the punishments for infidelity could be brutal, humiliating, and often deeply unequal. For women, the consequences were devastating. A wife caught in an affair risked everything, her reputation, her safety, even her life. In many towns, a woman accused of adultery could be dragged into public squares, stripped, and paraded as a warning to others. Chronicles tell of wives forced to ride backwards on donkeys while villagers hurled insults, or made to wear humiliating signs, marking them as sinners. In harsher cases, the punishment went further: imprisonment, mutilation, or execution. The underlying fear was always the same: that a wife's betrayal could introduce illegitimate heirs, polluting bloodlines and threatening the inheritance of noble estates. Her body was not seen as her own, but as property, and to violate that property was to invite the full weight of judgment. Men, by contrast, often faced far lighter consequences. A husband's infidelity was usually tolerated, if not openly ignored, especially if it involved prostitutes or women of lower status. Society excused these encounters as the natural weakness of men, a lesser sin compared to the scandal of a wife's betrayal. In some regions, the law technically punished both genders, but in practice, enforcement fell hardest on women. The double standard was glaring, and it revealed the imbalance of power that defined medieval sexuality. Even among the nobility, where affairs were often whispered about, the dangers remained. A queen accused of adultery could bring an entire dynasty to ruin. The case of Eleanor of Aquitaine illustrates this tension. Though never proven guilty of infidelity, her independence and powerful alliances drew constant suspicion, and rumors of affairs followed her throughout her reign. In courts across Europe, accusations of adultery could be wielded as political weapons, used to discredit rivals or justify annulments. It was a charge that could strip away honor more effectively than any sword. Adultery also revealed the deep entanglement of religion and law. The Church condemned it as a mortal sin, one that endangered not only the soul of the adulterer, but the entire community. Priests thundered from pulpits, warning that infidelity brought God's wrath upon households, fields, and villages. Yet, even as the Church condemned, it sometimes offered escape routes for the powerful. Wealthy nobles could pay penances, donate land to monasteries, or embark on pilgrimages as substitutes for punishment. For peasants, however, there was no such mercy. The poor bore their shame in flesh and blood, while the rich purchased forgiveness. What is striking is how often these stories of betrayal and punishment appear in medieval literature and art. Tales like those of Tristan and Isolde, or Lancelot and Guinevere, gave romantic shape to adultery, transforming it from sin into tragic passion. These legends reflected a hunger for stories of forbidden love, a counterpoint to the cold reality of arranged marriages. Yet even these tales ended in ruin, reinforcing the lesson that passion outside the boundaries of duty would always lead to downfall. The audience could dream, but the moral was inescapable. Betrayal carried consequences no one could escape. The punishments themselves often took on symbolic forms. In German towns, women accused of infidelity might be forced to shave their heads, stripping them of their beauty and marking them forever as disgraced. In Italy, some courts sentenced adulterous couples to march through the streets hand in hand, mocked by crowds. These rituals of humiliation were not only about justice, they were performances meant to terrify the community into obedience. Fear was the weapon, and shame the tool. And yet, despite these harsh realities, adultery never disappeared. Desire slipped through the cracks of duty, finding space in stolen glances and whispered exchanges and fleeting encounters under the cover of darkness. Some couples risked everything, driven by a longing too strong to suppress. Others were betrayed against their will, abandoned by spouses who sought pleasure elsewhere without fear of punishment. These secret lives remind us that even in a world bound by rigid rules, the human heart resisted. But where society sought to crush adultery, it also laid the foundation for even harsher judgments. For if a woman's desire could destroy a marriage, if her longing could corrupt an entire lineage, then what of those whose desires did not fit within marriage at all? What of those who sought love outside the narrow frame of husband and wife, who defied not just contracts, but the very categories of acceptable intimacy? In those cases, society's response was not simply humiliation, it was persecution, a punishment that reached into the darkest fears of the medieval world. And it was here, in the treatment of same-sex love, forbidden practices, and unorthodox desires, that the true cruelty of medieval control over sex revealed its sharpest edge. Desire in the Middle Ages was tightly policed, but nowhere did it provoke more fear and cruelty than when it took forms outside the sanctioned bond of marriage. Homosexuality, same-sex intimacy, and what were labeled unnatural acts were not simply frowned upon. They were condemned as sins against both God and nature, crimes that threatened not just individuals, but the moral fabric of society itself. To be accused of such practices was to be branded as an enemy of heaven, often with consequences as severe as those given to heretics or witches. The medieval church categorized homosexuality as one of the gravest sins, calling it sodomy, a word that encompassed far more than same-sex relations. It became a catch-all term for any sexual behavior that did not directly aim at procreation, including oral sex, anal sex, or even certain positions between husband and wife. But same-sex love bore the heaviest stigma. Preachers claimed that it invited divine punishment, pointing to biblical cities destroyed by fire as warnings. This fear was not just theological, it was deeply political. By labeling such desires as monstrous, authorities reinforced their control, turning private acts into public threats that justified surveillance and persecution. Punishments varied across regions, but carried the same message. Society would not tolerate deviation. In some cases, men convicted of sodomy were burned at the stake, their ashes scattered as a warning. Others were castrated, mutilated, or exiled. Women accused of same-sex intimacy faced ridicule, whippings, or imprisonment. Records from medieval courts showed chilling cases of young men executed simply for rumors of encounters, or women forced into convents after being accused of unholy affections. Fear was so pervasive that even close friendships between men or women could be viewed with suspicion, their intimacy interpreted as hidden sin. And yet, despite the threat of persecution, traces of same-sex love and desire still appear in the historical record. Letters survive from monks to one another, filled with language of longing that blurs the line between brotherhood and passion. In convents, chronicles reveal stories of nuns who shared beds, exchanged kisses, and were reprimanded by abbesses for behavior deemed inappropriate. Troubadour poetry from southern Europe occasionally hinted at affection between men, though it was always coded, wrapped in metaphors of loyalty and admiration. These fragments remind us that desire cannot be entirely extinguished, even when the cost of expressing it was death. One of the most paradoxical aspects of this repression is how fascinated society remained with what it claimed to despise. Legal documents described forbidden acts in graphic detail, almost reveling in the very imagery they condemned. Confessors' manuals instructed priests to interrogate penitents with precision, asking questions so intrusive that they seemed to betray curiosity as much as moral concern. It is as though the society that burned people for their desires could not look away from the fire itself, compelled to name, describe, and dwell upon what it sought to erase. This obsession with controlling desire also intersected with the era's fear of witchcraft and heresy. Those accused of practicing magic were often linked to sexual deviance, their alleged pacts with demons described in lurid terms of forbidden unions. Women labeled as witches were said to consort with one another in secret rituals, while heretics were accused of orgies that mocked the sacrament of marriage. These accusations reinforced the connection between sexual nonconformity and threats to order, making persecution a weapon not just of morality, but of political power. Yet even under this suffocating regime, cracks appeared. Some cities, particularly in Italy, developed underground communities where men sought out encounters with one another. In Florence, during the 15th century, records show a staggering number of prosecutions for sodomy, so many that it suggests not isolated sin, but widespread practice. The city gained a reputation across Europe as a place of hidden desire, a paradox where strict laws existed side by side with a culture that could not suppress what it condemned. These contradictions reveal how deeply human need resisted the structures built to contain it. Women's same-sex relationships, though less documented, were equally fraught. Because female sexuality itself was poorly understood and often dismissed, Intimacies between women sometimes slipped under the radar, but when discovered, they were treated as threats to both morality and gender order. Chroniclers accused women of using instruments to imitate men, a detail that appears in court cases where women were punished for daring to step outside the roles assigned to them. These stories not only expose persecution, but also suggest a hidden culture of experimentation, moments where women carved out space for their own desires despite the risks. What makes this history haunting is not only the violence of the punishments, but the loneliness it implies. To live with feelings that could never be spoken aloud, to know that love itself could lead to the stake, must have created an existence of constant fear and secrecy. The very act of reaching for another person became an act of rebellion. Intimacy turned into defiance. And yet, people still reached. They wrote letters, shared beds, risked meetings, and left behind faint traces of lives lived against the tide of condemnation. The treatment of same-sex intimacy in the Middle Ages shows us not only how sexuality was policed, but how power worked through fear. By demonizing certain desires, authorities reinforced hierarchies, silenced dissent, and deepened the sense of shame that already surrounded the body. But repression has consequences. The more forcefully society tried to erase these desires, the more they found expression in shadows, in whispered poetry, in secret rituals, and coded gestures. And, in those shadows, we see the beginnings of the contradictions that would later explode into accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and the policing of other hidden practices. For where there is fear, there's always imagination, and in the imagination of the medieval world, hidden pleasures and forbidden acts became monsters that haunted not only individuals, but entire communities. Behind the facade of sermons, prohibitions, and rigid moral codes, medieval society harbored a world of secrecy, where desire refused to be silenced. Despite the crushing weight of religious dogma and the harsh penalties for deviation, men and women continued to explore their sexuality in hidden ways, creating a shadowed realm of practices that rarely made it into official records, but whispered their presence through scattered traces in literature, law, and archaeology. This underground landscape of intimacy tells us more about the resilience of human longing than any sermon ever could, because it reveals how, even in the most repressive of ages, people still found ways to seek pleasure. One of the most provocative aspects of this hidden world was the use of objects to simulate or enhance sexual acts. Crude dildos fashioned from wood, leather, or even animal parts appear in scattered references, often mentioned in legal proceedings when their existence could no longer be ignored. In France, for example, there are court records of women accused of using such instruments with one another, their very possession of these objects used as evidence of sin. These cases shocked their contemporaries, not only because of the acts themselves, but because they represented a form of sexual autonomy, women daring to take control of their own desire in a world that demanded their submission. The fact that these accusations surface at all suggests that such objects were more common than society dared to admit. Similarly, there is evidence that anal sex, though condemned as one of the gravest sins, was not rare. Confessors' manuals ask detailed questions about it, and its repeated mention betrays its persistence. For some couples, especially those desperate to avoid pregnancy, these forbidden practices became strategies for survival. The church labeled them as sodomy, damning them alongside same-sex love, but the secrecy with which they were carried out ensured that the line between morality and reality was never truly aligned. It is unsettling to imagine how many couples carried this silent knowledge with them, balancing fear of eternal damnation against the practical concerns of everyday life. The culture of secrecy also spilled into literature. In bawdy tales like the Decameron, or Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, disguised under layers of humor, there are hints of the kinds of private acts people pursued in bedrooms. Characters cheat, use tricks to satisfy their urges, or mock the hypocrisy of priests and husbands alike. These stories, though fictional, reflect a society where the forbidden was always present, lingering at the edges of respectability. Manuscripts adorned with marginalia, tiny drawings sketched into the borders of holy texts, sometimes depict shocking sexual imagery, as if the scribes themselves could not resist slipping rebellion into the very heart of sacred work. These details, tucked away like secrets on a page, reveal that desire seeped into even the most sacred spaces. Medical texts also betray contradictions. While physicians publicly echoed church teaching, some privately acknowledged alternative practices or prescribed methods that indirectly encouraged them. Aphrodisiacs were recommended in the form of herbs, wines, or spices, suggesting that despite public condemnations, people still sought ways to ignite passion. Some of these recipes survive, including combinations of honey, ginger, and pepper believed to stir desire. Others suggested wearing amulets or charms inscribed with mystical symbols. Though unscientific, they reveal a hunger for pleasure strong enough to create a market for remedies that walk the line between medicine and magic. What is particularly revealing is how often these secret practices intersected with class. Among the nobility, affairs and experiments could sometimes be hidden behind the walls of castles, their participants shielded by power and wealth. Among peasants, secrecy took on a different form, woven into festivals, communal gatherings, and rustic traditions that allowed temporary suspension of the rules. Carnival, for example, became a space where hierarchies collapsed, masks concealed identities, and behavior condemned on ordinary days was briefly tolerated. Behind the laughter and celebration, it was a ritual of release, an acknowledgement that repression alone could not contain the human body. But secrecy carried immense risk. When discovered, these practices could ruin lives. A servant caught in a compromising situation might be cast out, a wife accused of hidden acts dragged before a church court, a man condemned to penance or worse. The fear of exposure haunted every touch, every whispered word, every hidden gesture. Yet paradoxically, this very danger may have intensified the allure. Forbidden acts gained a heightened sense of urgency, their secrecy transforming them into a rebellion against the suffocating world outside the bedroom. Even monasteries and convents, supposedly bastions of chastity, were not immune. Letters and chronicles reveal scandals in which monks or nuns were accused of breaking their vows in shocking ways. Some accounts describe women smuggling objects into convents, or men forming bonds that blurred the lines between brotherhood and desire. These were not mere rumors spread by enemies of the church. They appear in official investigations that sought to suppress but inadvertently preserve the record of human longing. The persistence of these practices, despite the dangers, tells us something essential. Repression never truly eradicates desire. It pushes it into hidden corners, transforming it into something darker, more secretive, and often more creative. Every forbidden act was both a risk and a statement, a refusal to let life be reduced to duty and sin. The gap between what people were told to be and what they actually did widened with every secret encounter, every whispered ritual, every hidden object. And it is precisely in that widening gap that society's contradictions deepened. For the more people sought pleasure in secret, the harsher the authorities became in their attempts to stamp it out. Laws grew stricter, sermons more fiery, and punishments more brutal. What began as private indulgence could quickly escalate into public scandal, leaving behind ruined reputations and shattered lives. And as repression tightened its grip, the fear of exposure intertwined with the fear of death itself. For in a world where childbirth was perilous, disease rampant, and medicine riddled with superstition, the pursuit of desire often led straight into the arms of suffering and mortality. And it was within the shadow of childbirth and the ever-present threat of death that the story of medieval sex grew even darker. The medical world of the Middle Ages was a landscape shaped less by science than by superstition, where physicians mixed fragments of ancient knowledge with folklore, magic, and faith. When it came to sex, fertility, and the body, medicine often served not to enlighten, but to reinforce fear and control. A doctor's authority rested not on experimentation or observation, but on dusty manuscripts, astrology charts, and inherited traditions. The result was a culture where sexuality was surrounded by rituals, potions, and treatments that were often useless, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally deadly. Much of medieval medicine traced back to Galen and Hippocrates, whose writings were preserved through translations by Arab scholars and slowly trickled into Europe. These ancient texts shaped the belief that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health, it was thought, depended on their balance, and sexual desire was interpreted through this lens. Excess lust, for example, was seen as a sign of overheated blood, while frigidity in women might be explained by a lack of warmth in the womb. Treatments followed accordingly: bloodletting to calm a man's desires, heated poultices to stir a woman's. There was no true understanding of hormones, fertility cycles, or anatomy, only metaphors that tried to make sense of mysteries through analogy. One of the most haunting examples was the treatment of venereal diseases. Before the advent of real medicine, physicians prescribed remedies that today sound more like torture. Mercury ointments were rubbed onto sores, believed to draw out the poison. Patients were forced to swallow potions of lead, arsenic, or crushed animal organs, all under the assumption that disease could be purged through pain. These cures often did more harm than good, leaving sufferers disfigured, poisoned, or dead. And yet, because illness was interpreted as punishment for sin, the agony of the cure was seen as part of the penance. People endured the suffering not only because they had no alternative, but because they believed it cleansed both body and soul. Fertility was another realm dominated by myth disguised as medicine. Couples desperate for children sought the help of midwives and physicians, who prescribed everything from herbal brews to elaborate rituals. Women were told to place amulets of hair bones around their necks, or to drink concoctions made of nettles, honey, and wine. Some were advised to time intercourse according to the stars, aligning their unions with favorable constellations. Astrology was inseparable from medicine. Doctors carried charts of the heavens and claimed that conception was more likely when the moon favored certain signs. To a modern eye, these rituals seem absurd, But in a world where infant mortality was high and heirs determined the future of dynasties, such practices carried enormous weight. Midwives stood at the center of this world, wielding a mix of practical experience and superstition. They delivered babies, offered contraceptive advice, and prepared remedies for women who suffered complications. Yet their authority was precarious. Celebrated when successful, they were accused of witchcraft when tragedies struck. A stillbirth or a mother's death in labor could bring suspicion, with neighbors whispering that the midwife had invoked dark forces. This fragile balance made childbirth not only a physical risk, but a social one, where women carried the weight of both biology and suspicion. Sexual performance itself was subject to medical scrutiny. Men who suffered impotence were often accused of being cursed, their condition attributed to sorcery or divine punishment. Remedies ranged from absurd diets, eating rooster testicles or drinking animal blood, to magical rituals, such as tying enchanted knots or reciting specific prayers during intercourse. Court records reveal cases where wives accused their husbands of impotence to annul marriages, and physicians were called upon to test the man's virility. The humiliation of such examinations reflected how deeply sexuality was tied to social order, where the failure to produce children was not only a personal issue, but a matter of public judgment. But while medicine imposed bizarre and sometimes cruel treatments, it also revealed society's desperate hunger for answers. Manuals circulated with detailed descriptions of sexual organs, often illustrated with crude diagrams. While inaccurate, these texts marked the beginning of an attempt to study the body, however flawed. The fascination with reproduction drove countless experiments, from dissecting animals to collecting testimonies from midwives. Yet without scientific method, conclusions remained entangled with myth, leaving generations trapped between ignorance and authority. Even in monasteries, where doctors trained, the contradictions were visible. Physicians who took vows of chastity wrote extensively about sex, fertility, and conception, their knowledge drawn not from experience, but from speculation and borrowed sources. Some monks kept herb gardens where they experimented with plants, said to stimulate desire or suppress it, creating a blurred line between medicine and magic. It is telling that many of these same herbs, like pennyroyal or rue, were later banned by the church, their use in controlling fertility condemned as interference with God's will. The blending of medicine and morality meant that every prescription carried a layer of judgment. Women were more likely to be treated as the cause of infertility, their bodies suspected of hidden flaws or sins. Men's failures were often excused as temporary imbalances, while women's struggles were framed as permanent defects. This double standard not only reinforced existing gender roles, but also deepened the silence around women's health. The womb was treated as a mysterious and dangerous organ, its ailments blamed for hysteria, madness, or illness of every kind. And yet, despite the weight of superstition, cracks slowly began to appear. Contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades exposed Europeans to more advanced medical knowledge, including detailed studies of anatomy and translations of Aristotle and Avicenna. These ideas did not immediately dismantle superstition, but they planted seeds of doubt. Slowly, new understandings of the body began to circulate, challenging old beliefs. But in the Middle Ages, these voices were faint, easily drowned out by the roar of tradition and the thunder of sermons. The medieval medical view of sex reveals not only ignorance, but also the profound fear that surrounded the human body. Disease, infertility, and desire were seen as puzzles too dangerous to solve. Better controlled through ritual than through knowledge, people placed their faith in remedies that often poisoned them, in charms that offered false hope, and in authorities who confused mystery with mastery. The result was a culture where medicine did not soothe anxiety, but amplified it, reminding people that their most intimate needs were always entangled with danger. And this fear did not stop in the bedroom or the sick room. It extended into the cloisters of monasteries and convents, where vows of chastity created a pressure cooker of repression, secrecy, and scandal. And in those cloisters, the struggle between flesh and spirit reached its most explosive form. Life inside monasteries and convents was designed to silence the body. Those who entered swore vows of chastity, renouncing the pleasures of flesh for the promise of spiritual purity. Walls rose high around these religious houses, not only to keep the outside world at bay, but to guard against the temptations within. Yet those walls, meant to separate the sacred from the sinful, could not erase human desire. Instead, they created a place where repression collided with reality, where secrecy fed scandal, and where the struggle between body and soul was at its most intense. The rules were harsh. Monks and nuns were expected to live in strict separation, dedicating themselves to prayer, labor, and study. Daily routines were meant to exhaust both mind and body. Hours of chanting in the cold of dawn, labor in fields or kitchens, silence broken only by prayers. The architecture itself reinforced control. Dormitories with narrow beds, windows too high to see through, doors locked at night. Yet none of these measures could extinguish the fact that human beings, even when cloistered, carried the same impulses as those beyond the cloister's gates. Desire lingered in whispered glances, in the warmth of shared tasks, in the long nights of silence where thoughts could not be banished by prayer alone. Records from inquisitions and church investigations show that monasteries and convents were not immune to scandal. In some cases, entire communities were accused of corruption, their members engaging in secret affairs that contradicted their vows. Chronicles from the 14th century tell of abbots who kept mistresses hidden within monastic walls, or abbesses who were accused of fostering relationships among their nuns. While many of these accounts were exaggerated by critics of the church, some reveal undeniable truths. Where desire was suppressed most fiercely, it often reemerged in the shadows. The secrecy of monastic life made it both easier to conceal and more shocking when discovered. In one case, from Germany, a group of nuns was accused of sharing beds and engaging in what authorities called sinful embraces. Their confessions, likely coerced, were used as evidence of widespread corruption, and punishments ranged from imprisonment to public penance. For monks, similar accusations were often tied to charges of sodomy, a sin considered so grave that it drew comparisons to heresy itself. The risk was immense, yet the very persistence of such records suggests that the desires they describe were real, even if exaggerated by hostile eyes. Not all scandals involve relations within the cloister. Priests and monks were often accused of maintaining relationships with women outside, breaking vows in ways that were both personal failings and institutional embarrassments. In some towns, priests kept unofficial wives, women who lived with them discreetly but openly enough for parishioners to notice. These relationships, though condemned, reveal the impossibility of completely severing human intimacy from life, even for those who dedicated themselves to God. The tension between expectation and reality weighed heavily on the entire institution, a silent contradiction at the heart of medieval spirituality. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of monastic sexuality was how often it intersected with coercion. Convents, in particular, were filled with women who had not freely chosen religious life. Daughters without dowries, or those deemed unsuitable for marriage, were placed behind convent walls by families eager to rid themselves of financial burdens. For these women, the cloister was not a calling but a prison. Within such confines, power imbalances flourished. Abbesses controlled not only discipline but daily survival, and stories emerge of younger nuns coerced into submission under the weight of obedience. In monasteries, too, younger novices often lived under the authority of older monks, creating a hierarchy where silence could mask abuse. Even so, the cloister was not only a place of repression and scandal. For some, it provided rare opportunities for female autonomy. In convents, women could access education, read texts, and even write works of mysticism and theology that would never have been allowed in secular life. Some of the most profound spiritual writings of the Middle Ages, by figures like Hildegard of Bingen, emerged from convent walls. Yet even in these luminous works, there is a tension, an undercurrent of bodily imagery that suggests how intertwined the spiritual and the sensual remained. Hildegard herself described visions of divine love in almost erotic terms, blurring the boundary between mystical union and human passion. The fascination with monastic sexuality was not limited to those within the cloisters. Secular society projected its own fears and fantasies onto monks and nuns. Satirical tales depicted lustful monks sneaking out of monasteries, or nuns secretly entertaining lovers. These stories, while exaggerated, reflected popular suspicion that those who claimed to be above temptation were in fact its most frequent victims. The hypocrisy of priests preaching chastity while failing to uphold it themselves fueled both mockery and resentment, seeding doubts that would later explode during the Reformation. But beneath the satire, the scandals, and the whispered stories, the deeper truth was that vows of celibacy demanded something profoundly unnatural. To deny the body entirely was to deny part of what it meant to be human, and the Church's insistence on total chastity created a fragile system where cracks were inevitable. Monasteries and convents became microcosms of the larger medieval struggle between flesh and spirit, repression and desire, authority and rebellion. And those cracks widened over time. For as much as monasteries tried to control the body, the wider culture still pulsed with images and practices that tied sex to spirituality in ways that could not be erased. Carvings in churches, manuscripts filled with body marginalia, and poems that mingled sacred love with sensual longing reveal a society that could not keep its faith and its flesh entirely apart. And it is in this mingling, where religion itself became infused with erotic imagery, that we see the next chapter of medieval sexuality, a paradox that blurred the line between worship and desire. Long before the Church cemented its authority over sexuality, Europe still carried the echoes of older traditions, where desire was tied to fertility, ritual, and even the divine. These remnants of pagan culture did not vanish completely in the Middle Ages. They lingered in rural festivals, in whispered superstitions, and in practices that blended sacred and sensual in ways the Church found threatening. What emerged was a clash between two worldviews, one that saw sex as a natural and sometimes mystical force, and another that insisted it was dangerous unless tightly controlled. The struggle between these perspectives left behind a fascinating record of contradictions, where medieval Christians outwardly condemned what they could not entirely eradicate. In many rural communities, ancient fertility rites survived under new disguises. Villagers still celebrated seasonal cycles with dances, bonfires, and rituals that carried strong sexual undertones. May Day, for example, was marked by young men and women dancing around the maypole, a symbol that scholars have long interpreted as a lingering echo of phallic worship. Couples often slipped away into the fields during these festivals, an indulgence tolerated by local custom even as priests preached against it. The vitality of nature was mirrored in human bodies, and people embraced the idea that fertility of land and fertility of flesh were intertwined. Some of these rituals carried the flavor of what might be called sacred prostitution, though in medieval Europe, the practice was no longer institutionalized as it had been in parts of the ancient world. Instead, traces of it appeared in folk customs, where sexual encounters were framed as offerings to ensure good harvests or to protect communities from misfortune. In certain accounts, women were expected to open planting seasons with symbolic acts that blurred the line between religious devotion and erotic ritual. Though the church sought to stamp out such practices, they persisted quietly in remote areas, passed down as traditions rather than open defiance. The tension between pagan survivals and Christian morality often revealed itself in the church's obsession with labeling certain festivals as sinful. Bonfire nights, carnival celebrations, and midsummer gatherings were repeatedly condemned in ecclesiastical decrees, yet they continued year after year. Priests complained that villagers drank excessively, engaged in promiscuity, and performed dances deemed indecent. Behind the outrage was a deeper fear, that the people were still bound to older rhythms of life, rhythms where sex was not merely tolerated but honored as a force of renewal. The church could control the pulpit, but it could not easily control the fields, the forests, or the communal celebrations that tied people to the cycles of nature. What makes this survival even more striking is how often the church itself absorbed and rebranded these traditions. Pagan symbols were not always destroyed but Christianized. Fertility festivals were recast as saints' days, maypoles were tolerated if draped in religious imagery, and erotic songs were rewritten with sacred lyrics. Yet the old meanings lingered beneath the surface, creating a double language where villagers celebrated both Christian ritual and pagan memory in the same breath. In this way, sexuality remained intertwined with spirituality, even if it was cloaked in new forms. Women played a central role in these practices, often as the keepers of folk knowledge. Midwives, healers, and wise women preserved herbal remedies that were as much about enhancing desire as about healing. Some plants, like mandrake root with its human-like shape, were thought to possess mystical powers of fertility. Others were used as aphrodisiacs, their preparation passed down through generations. The church frequently accused these women of witchcraft, not only because they used herbs, but because their knowledge represented an alternative authority over life, death, and the body. The overlap between pagan ritual, female sexuality, and accusations of sorcery would later erupt in the witch hunts, but its roots stretched back into these medieval survivals. Even in high culture, echoes of pagan sensuality remained. Medieval art and architecture sometimes incorporated fertility symbols in surprising places. Carvings on church walls depicted grotesques exposing themselves, reminders of older traditions where sexuality was not hidden but displayed as a protective charm. Manuscripts copied by monks included marginalia of naked figures, playful and obscene, tucked alongside sacred texts. These details reveal a world where the sensual could never be fully separated from the spiritual, where pagan echoes whispered even in the holiest spaces. And perhaps most revealing are the mystical writings that blurred the line between divine love and erotic passion. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg describe their visions of God in language so charged with sensual imagery that it is difficult to ignore the erotic undertones. While these were framed as mystical unions with the divine, they reflected a deep cultural inheritance in which sexuality and spirituality were not opposites, but entwined forces. The language of desire, suppressed in ordinary life, resurfaced in the very heart of religious devotion, carrying with it the unmistakable resonance of older traditions. The persistence of these echoes highlights the fragility of repression. Despite the Church's efforts, sexuality could not be erased from human experience. It seeped into festivals, into the practices of midwives, into the carvings of cathedrals, and even into the visions of saints. The body could not be silenced because it was inseparable from life itself, and the memories of a pre-Christian world ensured that sexuality remained tied to fertility, to mystery, and to the rhythms of the earth. But these survivals came at a price. As the Church tightened its grip in later centuries, especially with the rise of inquisitions, the tolerance for such practices diminished. What had once been seen as harmless folk tradition came to be viewed as dangerous heresy, and those who carried these echoes were increasingly persecuted. The suspicion of pagan survivals merged with fear of female sexuality, turning midwives, healers, and even ordinary villagers into targets of accusation. What began as whispered traditions would eventually become evidence in trials that ended in flames. And in that fire, the repression of sex in the Middle Ages reached its most terrifying expression as the fear of desire transformed into full-scale persecution. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was both a miracle and a battlefield. Every pregnancy carried with it the weight of uncertainty, for to bring life into the world was to stand face to face with death. Without modern medicine, anesthesia, or hygiene, labor was often long, excruciating, and perilous. Women entered childbirth surrounded not by doctors, but by midwives, neighbors, and family, relying on traditions passed down through generations rather than scientific knowledge. The outcome could be joy, but it could just as easily be tragedy, leaving behind a grieving family and another story whispered in the village about how fragile life truly was. For women, the fear was constant. To be married in the Middle Ages was to expect repeated pregnancies, often beginning in adolescence. Each birth carried the risk of complications: hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor. One misstep, one fever, one delay could end a life. Records suggest that in some regions, as many as 1 in 3 women died from childbirth-related causes. Every wedding vow was shadowed by the knowledge that the marriage bed would eventually lead to the dangers of the birthing bed. Husbands expected heirs, families demanded children, but the women who carried them bore the heaviest price. Midwives stood at the center of this drama. They were both respected and feared. Guardians of birth who brought new lives into the world, but whose failures could bring death. Their knowledge of herbs, positions, and breathing techniques gave them authority, yet their authority was precarious. When things went well, midwives were praised as saviors. When tragedy struck, suspicion fell quickly. Had the midwife made a mistake, or worse, invoked dark forces? This dual image made childbirth not only a medical event, but a spiritual and social one, charged with suspicion, awe, and fear. The rituals surrounding childbirth reveal the extent of this fear. Women in labor often clutched relics or rosaries, calling upon saints for protection. Saint Margaret, believed to have survived being swallowed by a dragon, became the patron of childbirth. Her story of miraculous escape, a source of comfort to women struggling through the agonies of labor. Priests were sometimes summoned to bless the birthing chamber, sprinkling holy water as though warding off evil itself. Even prayers were written specifically for the moment of delivery, pleading with God to spare both mother and child. The mix of sacred ritual and raw human desperation paints a vivid picture of how terrifying childbirth was in this world. And yet, despite the prayers and rituals, tragedy remained a frequent companion. Women who survived labor often faced the dangers of infection in the days afterward, fevers that swept through villages and claimed lives silently. Infants, too, were fragile, with high mortality rates ensuring that not every child born would live to adulthood. Families learned to brace themselves for loss, and baptism was often performed within hours of birth, not only as a spiritual necessity, but because parents knew the child's life could end before the day was done. The urgency of baptism reflected the belief that unbaptized infants would be denied entry into heaven, turning grief into both a personal and theological torment. Contraception, though attempted, was unreliable and dangerous. Women drank potions made of toxic herbs or wore charms meant to ward off conception. Some even resorted to primitive abortions, often at great risk to their own lives. The Church condemned all such practices as sinful interference with God's will, leaving women with little choice but to accept the cycle of pregnancy and risk as inevitable. For many, sex itself became a source of dread, the promise of intimacy overshadowed by the shadow of potential death. What should have been a bond between husband and wife often became another burden, heavy with unspoken fear. The experience of noble women differed in detail, but not in danger. For them, childbirth was also a matter of dynasty and politics. A queen or duchess was expected to produce heirs, and her value was tied to her fertility. Chronicles are filled with accounts of noble women who died young after bearing child after child, their bodies worn down by relentless expectation. Their deaths were tragedies for families, but also crises for kingdoms. For the survival of dynasties depended on the fragile bodies of women who were never given the choice to refuse. Curiously, some medical texts of the period reveal attempts to mitigate these risks, though their methods often bordered on superstition. Physicians advised placing a rooster's egg under the bed of a laboring woman to ease the birth, or tying magical knots in her garments to untangle the child in the womb. Certain herbs, like pennyroyal, were used to stimulate contractions, though in excessive doses they could be deadly. The line between medicine and magic blurred completely, leaving women at the mercy of remedies that might help but just as easily harm. The aftermath of childbirth also carried a heavy weight of ritual and judgment. Women who survived were considered unclean for weeks, barred from entering churches until a purification ceremony restored their spiritual purity. Known as churching, this ritual reinforced the idea that childbirth was not only a physical event, but a spiritual blemish that required cleansing. The very act of bringing life into the world was paradoxically treated as both sacred and polluting, a contradiction that mirrored the larger medieval view of sex itself. Yet despite all the fear, the pain, and the mortality, childbirth remained central to medieval society. It was both a private ordeal and a public necessity, the cornerstone of survival in a world where high infant and child mortality demanded that families produce many children just to ensure a few would reach adulthood. Every birth was a gamble, every pregnancy a test of endurance. The courage of women in this era is often left unspoken in chronicles dominated by men, but their silent struggles shaped the survival of entire communities. And it was this constant proximity to death that gave medieval sexuality its darkest undertone. For where modern intimacy often celebrates connection and pleasure, medieval intimacy was always shadowed by risk. To touch, to conceive, to give birth was to dance with mortality. And in a world so saturated with death, it is no wonder that art and literature too reflected these contradictions, weaving sexuality, desire, and fear into images and stories that survive carved in stone, painted on manuscripts, and sung in poems. And it is within this strange mix of piety and obscenity that we find the next chapter of the medieval story of sex. Even as the church thundered against lust from pulpits and confessors probed the most private corners of human life, art and literature betrayed a truth that could not be silenced. Desire had not vanished. It had simply been displaced, coded, and expressed through images, words, and symbols that walked a delicate line between the sacred and the profane. The medieval imagination was saturated with contradictions. On one hand, it carved cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts that celebrated piety. On the other, those very same cathedrals and manuscripts carried shocking depictions of eroticism, grotesque figures, and satirical images that seemed to mock the very morality the church tried to enforce. This tension created a cultural landscape where sexuality was never absent, only transformed. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, often copied painstakingly by monks, tiny drawings told a very different story than the sacred texts they surrounded. These marginalia featured rabbits mounting knights, priests exposing themselves, or nuns plucking penises from trees. While scholars still debate whether these were jokes, satire, or expressions of suppressed desire, their presence is undeniable. A monk illuminating the Psalms could not resist sketching obscene figures in the margins, as if to reclaim, in the quiet of his desk, the bodily impulses denied by his vows. The result was a double voice on the page. Sacred words in the center, forbidden fantasies at the edge. Cathedrals themselves became canvases for this strange interplay. Visitors to places like Chartres or Notre Dame might have lifted their eyes in awe at the soaring architecture, only to find, carved into the stone, grotesque figures exposing their genitals or engaging in sexual acts. These carvings, known as shilanagigs in some regions, were often exaggerated female figures displaying their vulvas, symbols that blended fertility imagery with warnings against lust. To modern eyes, they appear shocking, but in their time they reflected both fascination and fear, an acknowledgement of sexuality's power carved into the very walls of God's house. Some scholars argue they were intended as moral warnings, while others see them as remnants of pre-Christian fertility cults. Either way, they testify to a truth medieval society could not erase. The body haunted even the most sacred spaces. Literature, too, bore this dual nature. The courtly love tradition of the 12th and 13th centuries elevated desire into a poetic ideal where knights pined for unattainable ladies and women wielded power through their aloofness. While framed as pure and noble, these tales often pulsed with erotic undertones. Behind the verses of longing was the suggestion of forbidden passion, a world where love outside marriage was celebrated, if only in song. Works like The Romance of the Rose blended allegory with sensual imagery, guiding readers through gardens of desire that were as much about the body as about the soul. Such texts scandalized moralists, yet they spread widely, copied and cherished even by those who publicly condemned them. Even more explicit were the fabliaux, short comic tales that thrived in France. These stories mocked priests, husbands, and wives alike, often featuring trickery, adultery, and bawdy escapades. A miller's wife deceives her husband to sleep with a student. A priest is outwitted by a clever girl. A jealous husband finds himself humiliated. The fabliaux stripped away the solemnity of sex, portraying it instead as earthy, ridiculous, and unstoppable. They reveal that medieval audiences, far from being prudish, enjoyed laughing at the very taboos their culture pretended to uphold. Erotic imagery also appeared in medical and instructional texts, often cloaked in the language of education. Some manuscripts included diagrams of sexual organs or lists of positions, justified as guides for conception or warnings against sin. But the level of detail and the artistry involved betray something more, a fascination with the very subject they claimed to control. In this sense, knowledge itself became erotic, as scholars, monks, and physicians lingered over descriptions that blurred the boundary between science and desire. One of the most intriguing spaces where art and sexuality intersected was mysticism. Religious visions recorded by female saints often used the language of sensuality to describe union with God. They spoke of being embraced, penetrated by divine light, or wounded by love. While these metaphors were understood as spiritual, their imagery carried undeniable erotic weight. In their yearning for the divine, these mystics echoed the same language used by poets to describe human passion. This overlap reveals how inseparable sexuality and spirituality were in the medieval imagination, two forces entwined in ways the church could never fully unravel. The fascination with erotic imagery was not only about desire, but also about control. By depicting lust in grotesque forms, leering demons, monstrous hybrids, or exaggerated figures, the church sought to frighten believers into obedience. At the same time, these depictions ensured that sexuality remained ever present in the minds of the faithful, a temptation never far from sight. Fear and fascination worked together, reinforcing the idea that the body was both irresistible and dangerous. Yet the persistence of these images, stories, and poems shows that medieval society was not as uniformly repressed as we often imagine. People laughed at dirty jokes, carved obscene figures into holy places, and passed down tales that mocked the very authorities who tried to silence them. Sex may have been policed, but it was never forgotten. It lived in the margins, in the shadows, and in the laughter of peasants gathered around a storyteller. This paradox, where the sacred and the obscene existed side by side, created a cultural richness that defined the Middle Ages. To live in that time was to navigate a world where desire was simultaneously condemned and celebrated, hidden and displayed, ridiculed and feared. And it was this contradiction that set the stage for the darkest turn of all. For when fascination and fear could no longer be contained by satire or carvings, society turned instead to persecution. Sexuality, already tied to superstition and sin, became a weapon in accusations of witchcraft, heresy, and corruption. And in those accusations, the repression of the body reached its most violent and tragic expression. By the late Middle Ages, the long history of repression, superstition, and fear surrounding sex began to harden into something far more violent. What had once been whispers in confessionals or warnings from pulpits became accusations in courts and sentences carried out in public squares. Sexuality was no longer merely a matter of morality, it became evidence of corruption, of heresy, of witchcraft. In this climate, the body itself was put on trial, and desire was transformed into a weapon that could destroy reputations, families, and lives. The witch hunts that swept across Europe in the late medieval and early modern period had their roots in these centuries of fear. Women, especially those who lived on the margins of society, widows, midwives, healers, were accused of harnessing their sexuality for demonic purposes. In the logic of the time, a woman who lived without a husband was suspect, for she was seen as ungoverned, uncontrolled, and therefore dangerous. If she possessed knowledge of herbs, she could be accused of using them to stir lust or prevent conception. If she was outspoken, she could be painted as a seductress, conspiring with the devil. Sexuality and sorcery became intertwined in the medieval imagination, with witches described as engaging in orgies with demons or using their bodies to corrupt men. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 15th century, reflects this obsession. It described women as insatiable in their lust, claiming they turned to demons because men could not satisfy them. The text instructed inquisitors to question accused women about their sexual relations with spirits, forcing confessions of unnatural unions. The grotesque fantasies of these interrogations reveal not the reality of women's lives, but the anxieties of a society that saw female sexuality as inherently unruly, needing to be controlled through fear and fire. Behind every accusation lay centuries of teaching that framed women as temptresses, echoes of Eve whose desire could doom mankind once again. Adultery, too, became more than a personal failing. It became legal evidence of sin that could justify extreme punishments. In some towns, women caught in affairs were forced to wear iron collars or paraded through the streets in shame. Husbands could use accusations of infidelity to strip wives of property or even to push them into convents. In noble courts, rumors of adultery were wielded as political weapons, capable of bringing down queens or altering the succession of dynasties. The female body was not just a site of pleasure or pain, it was a battlefield where power was contested and enforced. Men were not free from these accusations, though the weight was lighter. Homosexuality, for example, was increasingly punished with severity, as sodomy became linked not only with sin, but with treason against God and society. Trials of men accused of same-sex acts often ended in execution by fire, the most public and terrifying of punishments. To burn the body was to signal that such desires would not merely be hidden, they would be eradicated. And yet, the very frequency of these trials suggests how persistent such desires were, surviving even in the face of death. What stands out in this period is how sexuality became entangled with fear of disorder. Authorities worried that desire left unchecked could unravel the stability of the family, the community, the kingdom itself. A woman accused of witchcraft threatened not just individuals, but the entire moral order. A man accused of sodomy symbolized rebellion against divine law. A couple caught in adultery represented the collapse of lineage and inheritance. In every case, sexuality was not treated as private, but as profoundly public. Its policing essential to the survival of society as the Middle Ages understood it. Art and literature mirrored this anxiety, shifting from the playful obscenity of earlier centuries to darker imagery. Paintings of witches' sabbaths showed naked bodies cavorting with demons, reinforcing the terror that sexuality could cross the boundary into the supernatural. Moral plays, staged on village greens, warned audiences of the eternal damnation awaiting those who indulged in lust. Even as people laughed at bawdy jokes in secret, the public message was clear. Sex was a danger that could destroy not only the body but the soul. Yet, beneath the surface, resistance remained. The very need for such extreme punishments reveals that desire never disappeared. People continued to seek intimacy in hidden corners, to pass down remedies and practices whispered from mother to daughter, to tell stories of forbidden love, even as others burned at the stake. The repression of sexuality created fear, but it also created secrecy, a hidden world that refused to die. And in that hidden world, humanity's most basic instincts survived, waiting for a future where they could be spoken without terror. The story of sex in the Middle Ages, then, is not one of absence, but of constant tension. It is the story of bodies covered in layers of dirt, duty, and doctrine, yet still pulsing with desire. It is the story of societies that sought to control intimacy through fear, yet could never fully suppress it. And it is the story of how repression shaped not only personal lives, but the entire structure of law, art, religion, and politics. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, cracks began to show in this fortress of control. New medical knowledge, humanist philosophy, and even shifts in religious thought started to challenge the old taboos. Desire, once painted as the devil's trap, began to be reclaimed as part of human nature. But the shadows of the Middle Ages lingered, shaping centuries of shame and silence that would not easily be undone. The legacy of that repression reminds us that sexuality has always been more than private. It has been political, spiritual, and deeply human, carrying with it the power to liberate or to destroy, depending on how society chooses to see it.